Welcome back to the 74th online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Pint with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, live streaming from the IMC in Azusa, California. Last time you saw me, we looked at blessing number 32 on practicing the Brahma fairing. With the Dhamma talk today, we'll continue on our journey through the 38 blessings to the third blessing in the practice for the eradication of defilements subsection. That is number 33 on Seeing the Four Noble Truths. So today's session will run to about an hour and 10 minutes, starting with a 20-minute talk on suffering, its origin and cessation, then 30 minutes of meditation and 20 minutes on practice for an end of suffering. Previous 32 blessings have been an important springboard towards liberation, or purity at transcendental level. We have reached a part of the 38 blessings which you could really call the business end of the sequence. In blessing 32, we discussed levels of mental attainment with a strategy for achieving escape velocity to leave the triple world behind, starting with the sensual and continuing through the form and formless planes. Nonetheless, amongst world religions, the knowledge of anything beyond the triple world remains unique to Buddhism, with nirvana transcending mundane existence. All the blessings we've studied so far, those that have placed the most emphasis on earnest practice have been those dealing with the austerities and the Brahma fairing. They've advocated the use of austere techniques to burn up the defilements in the mind, overcoming laziness and habitual bad habits concerning the use of clothing, food, and shelter. In the previous blessing on practicing the Brahma fairing, we sowed seeds of goodness in the pure mind, almost like the process of smelting a metal to purity, with the proviso that overcoming impurities in the mind relies on acquiring transcendental happiness to replace our mundane happiness. As switching the staple diet of the mind from mundane to transcendental happiness becomes habitual, it will redirect our destiny to the corresponding transcendental realm or lead to no further rebirth. Following through the prescribed stages, the clarity and brightness of the mind will increase. As the brightness of your mind increases, the mind will have the ability to perceive reality as it really is. If you're able to appreciate such reality, it becomes possible to reach an end of suffering and attain real happiness. Buddhism refers to seeing reality in a way that can bring you to an end of suffering as seeing the Noble Truths, which is the subject of today's blessing. And before I go further, I should give due credit to Longpo Tachiwo's book, The Buddha's First Teaching, which is where you can find more detail on the Four Noble Truths than I can go into on this session. Although I've tried to keep things as simple as possible, I should warn you in advance that this blessing and the remaining 4 blessings of the Mangala Sutta may, of necessity, get a little technical, so watch out for lots of tables and small print towards the end of this session. So what are the 4 Noble Truths that Blessing 33 advocates us to see? The 4 Noble Truths we are talking about consist of the Noble Truth of Suffering, or Dukkha Ariya Satya, the Noble Truth of the Origin of Suffering, or Samudaya Ariya Satya, the Noble Truth of Cessation of Suffering, or Nirodha Ariya Satya, and the Noble Truth of the Path to Cessation of Suffering, in Pali either Magga Ariya Satya or Dukkha Nirodha Gamini Patipada Ariya Satya. If you were to compare these to healthcare, you could compare suffering to the condition of being sick, the origin of suffering to the pathogen, bacteria, or virus, the cessation of suffering to the condition of being healed from the sickness, and the path to the medicine that cures the sickness. To take the metaphor further, it can be said that everyone in the world is sick with the disease of suffering. For the most part, however, the best they can do is to try to deny its existence or protest with the question, why is it happening to me? Without knowing the Four Noble Truths, no one can really know the nature or the cause of the sickness, let alone cure it. Scripturally speaking, the source of our knowledge of the Four Noble Truths is the Samutta Nikaya's Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It's considered one of the most important teachings for Buddhists to commit to memory, because it's effectively a manifesto for all the teachings the Buddha subsequently gave, because all the other teachings effectively expand on the Four Noble Truths of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Familiarity with the Four Noble Truths will allow us to know the real nature of suffering and how we can extricate ourselves from it. Early Western scholars of Buddhism, like Hermann Oldenburg, mistakenly came to the conclusion that the main message of Buddhism is all doom and gloom, alleging that its Tao teaching is that existence is a curse, that beings swim around in a vast ocean of suffering, and that human life is a misery. Not surprisingly, such scholars equated Buddhism with pessimism. Historically, this assessment has been exploited by colonial missionaries to promote more cheerfully disposed competing religions. Of course, it depends on your definition of pessimism, whether you think it makes for a pejorative assessment of Buddhism. Generally, pessimism is designed as seeing the worst in things, believing the worst will happen, and thinking we live in the worst possible of worlds. A definition which doesn't really match up with Buddhist worldview. Although some teachers have sought to bright-side Buddhist ethics by translating dukkha as stress or glibly depicting life as less than ideal or not fully satisfactory, most like Walpola Rahula settle for a middle ground, saying Buddhism is neither pessimism nor optimism but realistic. So if you have philosophical tendencies and it is an important question to you whether Buddhism is pessimistic, closest to the truth would probably be to say that Buddhism is not unduly pessimistic, because although the existence of suffering is not denied, it is actually the path to the end of suffering which is Buddhism's raison d'etre. In effect, the Buddha didn't describe the truths he taught as optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic, but he chose to use the word noble. The reason the Buddha called the truths noble is because they are noble in themselves as they transcend the mundane. They were also discovered by someone who was noble, who had attained the stages of enlightenment, and knowing about them will make the attainer noble. It is considered essential to study the Four Noble Truths at the very least to know what we are looking for. Though the Four Noble Truths may seem obvious, they have been overlooked for many aeons. The Four Noble Truths, like an undiscovered continent, have existed as long as the earth itself. However, even though they existed, people failed to notice them. It's like a person who works in a funeral parlor every day of their life, but never stopped to reflect on the transitory nature of their own life. To see the Noble Truths is not the work of a single day, but even if we cannot complete the task immediately, at least we can know the route to take us there, so that in the future we can point ourselves in the right direction and continue with this work. The discovery of the Four Noble Truths had to wait for many aeons, which is how long it takes for someone to train themselves sufficiently well in the 38 blessings to discover the Four Noble Truths afresh. If a person of such ability has not arisen in the world will remain in ignorance concerning those truths. Even after a person has recognized the Four Noble Truths, even though they might be able to alert others, it doesn't mean that those who have been warned will take them seriously. The Four Noble Truths are difficult to appreciate because of our relationship to them, especially suffering. It's rather like a fish's relationship to water. We are so mixed up in the suffering of the human condition that we fail to get any real perspective. So the idea of this blessing is to at least familiarize ourselves with what to expect from the Noble Truths. Later, as we practice further, then we'll be able to recognize the Noble Truths for ourselves. So let's turn now to look at each of the Four Noble Truths in turn. The Pali word used for the noble truth of the existence of suffering is dukkha. This ancient word literally means awkwardness or discomfort of body or mind. And some scholars of Sanskrit, like Monier Williams, have supposed its etymology comes from the same root as an off-center axle hole. You can imagine what it feels like riding on a cart where the wheels are off-center. You probably have a good metaphor for the existential angst that dukkha brings. The Buddha saw that every living being in the world is plagued by suffering. although poor people suffer in one way while billionaires suffer in another, but none can avoid suffering. The Buddha delineated 12 major categories of suffering, of which 3 types are inevitable and 9 types are mitigable or, to a greater degree, avoidable. Let's start with the category of inevitable suffering, or swabhava dukkha. It means it doesn't matter what realm of existence you inhabit, you cannot escape this type of suffering, no matter whether you are human, angel, or a god. The first sort of inevitable suffering is birth, or chata. Most people wonder why the Buddha claimed birth is a form of suffering, in contrast to most religions of the world which assume it's a blessing to be born. Granted, in Dhammapada verse 182, the Buddha characterized human birth as a great and valuable opportunity in his Giccho Manusapatilabho proverb. In contrast to other religions, the Buddha taught that the process of birth is of a nature of suffering. Human birth is fraught with 10 different features of suffering. Suffering of being confined to the womb, of physical shocks to the womb, of problematic childbirth, of undergoing childbirth for the baby, and of being cleaned up after birth. Birth is also a starting point for all the other sorts of human suffering, such as curtailed life or wounds in combat. Outside of human birth, it goes without saying that birth can lead to extreme suffering, particularly if it's in the hell realms, in the animal kingdom, or in the realm of hungry ghosts. The second form of inevitable suffering is aging, or chara, which is clearly seen from the sighs and groans of old people each time they have to get up from their chairs. Most people think that aging catches up with you when you're 70 or 80 years old. However, the worst aspects of aging are not the grey hair and wrinkles, but the inbuilt entropy of the body, working away in our cells from the moment we are born, something that has been compared to an unseen fire which reduces a forest to cinders, or a storm which leaves nothing but debris in its wake. The third form of inevitable suffering is death, or marana, which is a form of suffering that all beings must undergo as they leave one existence for the next, no matter whether they are rich or poor, have led a good life or a bad one. In spite of bravado, it is really only those who have attained transcendental attainments who don't fear the onset of death. This is why the Buddha referred to death as suffering, because whether it be the excruciating scorching sensation that seems to penetrate the whole of a dying person's body, having to face pre-death omens and visions, the struggle of clinging to possessions or loved ones in vain, and the special torment of death in the case of execution. In contrast to the 3 forms of inevitable suffering, there are 9 forms of suffering that, given the know-how, it's possible to minimize. This mitigable suffering, known in Pali as pakinaka dukkha, which literally just means miscellaneous suffering, refers to the sort of suffering that is caused by unskillful deployment of the mind. It's a category of suffering which can be minimized by wise reflection and mental training. If you know the method to mitigate this sort of suffering, you can, to a large extent, minimize your misery, especially by changing your attitudes at a deeper level. The first form of mitigable suffering is sorrow, or sokha, which is characterized as dry-minded suffering, for example, that of a mother with a newborn baby that she must leave in daycare despite her better instincts. Her anxiety leads to dry-minded sorrow. The second form of mitigable suffering is lamentation, or pariteva, which is sorrow that drives you to tears, such as the suffering of someone attending the funeral of a loved one. The third form of mitigable suffering is pain, or dukkha, which refers to physical suffering. The Buddha characterized this sort of suffering as originating from illness, corporal punishment, or incarceration, especially when it must be endured alone and without the support of friends or relatives. Such pain can even come in the form of mental anguish, perhaps as a result of poverty, being unable to afford clothes and jewelry to wear like more fortunate people. The lack of choice and seeming unfairness of one's circumstances are the hallmarks of this sort of suffering. The fourth form of mitigable suffering is feeling slighted, or domanassa, which is where one has a chip on one's shoulder. To be aggressively sensitive about a particular shortcoming, or if one bears a grudge. Some people bear a grudge against their parents for not having shown them more love. Some bear a grudge against their partner for giving them less affection than they feel they deserve. The fifth form of mitigable suffering is despair, or as it's sometimes called, bemoaning, coming from the Pali word upayasa, which is where you give up any hope of success in something. You might see a task which is so great that you give up hope of ever completing it. The sixth form of mitigable suffering is exposure to hateful things, or apiyehi sampayoka, which is a form of suffering the Buddha characterized as cloudedness of mind, grief, and melancholy, which results from being forced into close proximity with things we detest. It's often things that offend our senses. When we can't remove them or escape from them, it only adds to the suffering in our mind. The seventh form of mitigable suffering is separation from loved ones and treasured things, or piyehi vipayoka, which is the sort of suffering where we are in the habit of indulging our senses with something, but when that source of pleasure is no longer available to us, then there is the sense of heartbreak from parting or from other forms of withdrawal. Such suffering can be seen in separation from loved ones, perhaps a bereavement, or from treasured things, possessions, home, or honors. Such separation will bring us misery for as long as we still harbor attachment in our hearts. The eighth form of mitigable suffering is disappointment, or alapa, which is the sort of suffering where you are thwarted from getting what you want. It can refer to physical disappointment or spiritual disappointment. Supposing, in spite of working hard, a person still doesn't get a promotion or some other form of recognition, physical disappointment is what they feel as a result. The same suffering can apply to more abstract forms of disappointment, like not making progress in meditation, which would be categorized as spiritual disappointment. For as long as we still harbor such disappointment in our hearts, it will only add to our misery. Ninth and last, we come to the suffering of clinging to the aggregates, or panchupadana khandha dukkha, the five aggregates or psychophysical constituents that are the building blocks of the body and mind can cause us attachment and therefore lead to our suffering. The reason that attachment to the five aggregates causes suffering is that they belong to the mundane world and therefore keep us imprisoned inside that world. They are sometimes therefore referred to as the aggregates of clinging. For people in general who never studied Dhamma or listened to sermons concerning suffering, when they are overtaken by old age, sickness, or death, it comes as a major shock. As for those who have achieved some level of enlightenment, or who have at least heard the teachings of the Buddha, the inevitability of such suffering presents less of a surprise. Faced by inevitable suffering, the wise reflect that all beings are subject to suffering irrespective. In this way, you won't feel as if you are being singled out for unfair treatment, since all are equal in the face of suffering. At the same time, for mitigable suffering, we can work with the mind to minimize the touch of suffering to the best of our ability. The second noble truth is that of the origin of suffering, which uses the Pali word samudaya. When people are ignorant of the real reason behind their suffering, they tend to clutch at straws by pointing the finger at anything they can think of. Some blame God or the evil eye. Some blame their in-laws, the government, or foreign countries. If they fail their examinations, they blame their teachers. They will do anything to make sure that they pass the buck. The last thing they think of is to blame themselves. So the innovation of the Buddha was to teach us to blame ourselves for a change, at least to blame ourselves for not having completely dealt with that craving that remains in the mind that is the origin of suffering. The Buddha taught that we suffer because we still have defilements in the mind. The defilements in the mind that cause craving or tanha, which express itself in different ways. The Buddha taught in the Anguttara Nikaya about there being three different forms of craving. Craving for sense pleasure or Gama tanha, craving for the form realms or Bhava tanha, and craving for the formless realms or Vibhava tanha. The wise recognize these three forms of craving as the origin of all forms of suffering. If craving can be avoided, the suffering of birth, old age, and death will be escaped. The craving in people's minds is seen as the chain that imprisons beings in the endless cycle of existence. The third noble truth is known as the extinction or cessation of suffering, and it uses the Pali word nirodha. The Buddha found that craving can only be overcome if it is extinguished. The way that craving can be extinguished is by eradicating the defilements in the mind. If defilements are reduced, craving is reduced too. If craving is reduced, suffering will be reduced. If you can bring craving to an end, then there is nothing further to bring you back into rebirth. If there's no rebirth, then that will eradicate suffering at its root. Furthermore, cessation of suffering is something we can attain for ourselves. We don't have to wait for an unknown factor or external agent or deity to do the work for us. So to slip in a quick scriptural story before we come to time for our meditation today, I'd like to tell you about a young lady who, after undergoing unthinkable suffering in her life, was able to see through it and redeem herself. The lady in question lived in the city of Savatthi 2,600 years ago. She was known as Kissa Gotami on account of her slim body. Formerly, she had married a rich young man and given birth to a son, but the son died when he was just a toddler, and Kissa Gotami was stricken with grief. She could not accept her son's death, and, like a demented woman, carried his tiny body around, roaming the neighborhood, asking strangers for any medicine that could bring her son back to life. Most people she met backed away from her, but one compassionate man, realizing the depth of her trauma, advised her, "Sister, the Buddha is the person you should approach. He has the medicine that you need." She followed his advice, going to the temple and asking the Buddha for medicine that would restore her dead son to life. As her skillful means, the Buddha sent her to look for some mustard seeds from any home where there had been no death. Overjoyed at the possibility of having her son restored to life, Kissa Gotami ran from house to house, begging for some mustard seeds. Everyone wanted to help her, but she could find no single home where there hadn't been a death. As the day dragged on, the truth dawned on her that she was not alone in dealing with death. She was able to let go of grief for her son and realize the important lesson the Buddha was trying to teach her, that everything born must eventually die. She performed the funeral rites for her son and returned to the Buddha, who said, "Gotami, you should not think that you are the only one who has lost a son. Death comes to all beings. Before their desires are satiated, death carries them away." Now, seeing clearly the short and impermanent nature of life, Kissa Gotami decided to renounce the worldly life and enter the community of nuns. Once ordained, she worked hard on her meditation and religious duties. One night, she lit some oil lamps and, observing the flames, noticed that while some flared up, others flickered out. In her meditation, she realized, as with these flames, so is it with the living beings of this world. Some flare up while others flicker out. Only those who have attained nirvana will be seen no more. After further teaching from the Buddha, within a short time, Kissa Gotami was able to attain arahantship, thereby extinguishing the cause of suffering at its root. So now that we are a little more well-informed about what is meant by suffering, its origin and cessation, let's see if we can get closer to extinguishing the cause of suffering at its root by settling ourselves down for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent live recording of the track entitled Spreading the Light of Hope. If at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So now that we feel ready to meditate, we can start by adjusting our sitting position to be as comfortable as possible. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting on the floor or on a chair, as long as you find yourself settling down into the most comfortable possible position. If you're sitting on the floor, then make sure that neither of your legs are tense as you cross them. And make sure there's nothing to impede the smooth circulation of your blood throughout your legs. You can place both of your hands palm upwards in your lap. And if you're sitting on a chair, then it's probably best to have both feet flat on the floor and your back extended to its full height, with your chin horizontal and both hands resting in your lap as comfortably as possible. Ensure that your blood circulates freely all the way from the top of your head down to the tips of your toes. And breathe deeply to yourself 2 or 3 times. And with each breath, allow your attention to be drawn back within yourself, breathing in until your awareness is located down at the deepest point of your abdomen. And as you breathe out, then breathe as slowly as you can. Allow your breath to embody your awareness and bring it back to the present moment. Allow your shoulders to drop to their natural height as you follow the breath a few more times. Also confirming that your sitting posture is as comfortable as possible. Allowing your mind to remain in place for the longest possible time, with no physical discomfort to bother it. And if at any time later on any discomfort should return, we can just feel free to gently adjust ourselves at any time. So we adjust our sitting posture to be as comfortable as possible, while bringing our awareness back to become aware of our bodily sensations, relieving any remaining tension, starting from the top of our head, scanning gently down through our body, relaxing the muscles of our forehead, down through our face and cheeks, allowing the relaxation to scan down through our neck and shoulders, letting the flow of relaxation move down through our arms to our hands, all the way to the tips of our fingers. Feeling the relaxation in our chest and letting it flow all the way down through our abdomen, to our legs, our feet, and all the way to the tips of our toes, until we feel that all the remaining tension is flushed out from our whole body, especially in the muscles of our face or our shoulders, allowing them to be completely relaxed, at ease and comfortable. Because when our body is comfortable, it's very easy for our mind to become still and remain undistracted. So take as much time as you need to make sure the whole of your body feels at ease. And if your mind wanders or begins to become distracted, there's no real need to fight those thoughts. Just bring the attention back gently to the relaxation of the body, conjuring up a feeling as if you were going on holiday, taking a vacation, picturing yourself sitting alone in serene and natural surroundings. Might be on a beach, on the top of a mountain, in the middle of a forest, or even in the desert. Anywhere that you'd like to be, where you'd feel the most contented. And imagine yourself in the middle of that place, at its center, as if you were becoming one with those serene and natural surroundings. As if right here were your personal corner of paradise, where you can take a step back from the busy world outside, as a place where you can rest and re-energize your mind, taking a moment to observe your surrounding space and feel as if it slowly expands outwards all the way to the horizon. And you might notice the way at the center of this space, your entire body is embraced by a sense of peace and tranquility, allowing your awareness to come to a standstill within this sensation of peace. By a standstill, I mean that the thoughts die down into silence, allowing us slowly to decompress, let go of any remaining thoughts, feelings, or residual emotions, any frustrations or worries that still clutter the mind. You might allow yourself to feel as if those worries and frustrations are gently blowing away like thistledown or the seeds on a dandelion clock, freeing up our mind from all the burdens we've been carrying inside us. Because whatever they may be, this is the time for us to rest, to just be. And that begins with unburdening our own mind from all sorts of mental clutter, letting them go one by one, little by little, until our mind feels as comfortable as our body, feeling free, almost liberated, as if everything inside us has become light in weight, spacious, expanding, becoming wider, unburdened. And the feeling when our mind breaks free from negativity, almost like clouds floating free in the sky, free of control, free of any kind of force, defying gravity, free and unconstrained. So take as long as you need to free up your mind until the body merges with the space that surrounds you. And at this point you might slowly bring your attention back inside the center of yourself, somewhere around the middle of your abdomen, the place that your mind feels the most comfortable to rest. And here at the center we can connect with our true self deeper inside. So we gently place the mind, place the awareness at the center of ourself. somewhere round about the middle of our abdomen, observing the gradual increasing sense of peace that slowly immerses our mind, continuously and gently. Because here at the center, our mind finally feels that it has returned home after a long journey to a place where it can just rest, be still, and re-energize. Doesn't need to do anything, to engage with anyone or anything outside itself. It's the time for the mind to rest, to sit back and relax, allowing the mind finally to shed all its ingrained negativity. And here at the center, to keep the mind in place, if we like, we can imagine an image by visualizing something as a point of reference for the mind, or as an anchor to allow it to settle. In this respect, you can visualize a bright full moon, perhaps the sun shining, twinkling star, or perhaps a sparkling diamond. Allowing the image slowly to emerge at the center of ourself with its own sense of radiance. A radiance that expands outwards from that central point. Even if we don't see it, we can probably feel the presence of the object. Feel the way in which it radiates a sense of well-being from that central point outwards. So we continue to train the mind in this way, lightly and gently, keeping our mind on track at the center of the body in this way for a few more moments in silence until we come to the appropriate time.
We continue to keep our mind on track at the center of the body the whole of the time. If we find our attention wandering off onto other things, each time we realize, we just bring our attention back again to the center of the body as before. If the inner object disappears, we can think of a new one. If it changes, we can just follow it in its new form. There's no need for us to change it back again. If thoughts recur in the mind, then we do our best to ignore them. But if they're too persistent to ignore, we may make use of that traditional mantra, hearing the sound of the words Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, coming up from the center of our inner object, for as long as it takes for the thoughts in the mind to settle down into silence. We continue in this way for a few more moments in silence until we come to time for some loving-kindness meditation. Continue to maintain our awareness at the center of the inner experience we have built up for ourselves as a result of the meditation so far. Sometimes that inner experience is like a form of peace energy, which remains motionless at the center of ourselves. But with a little bit of encouragement, as we touch gently with our awareness at the center of that inner experience, whether it be a sense of well-being, a sense of inner illumination, or inner imagery, then that peace energy becomes more fluid, extending outwards from the central point. In fact, the energy is always there, but it becomes more noticeable whenever the mind is pure and free from mental impurities, such as greed, hatred, or delusion. That sense of peace inside will transform into loving kindness, compassion, good wishes, and positive intention that we can extend towards ourselves or others. And extending that peace energy outwards is extended with a sense of hope that begins within our own minds. So we're able to reach out and share this light, this inner energy, this sense of hope beyond ourselves, in a way that hope becomes more than just an idea, but something that can be shared through the practice of meditation. So the starting point of a sense of hope within our own mind starts when the mind becomes free of thought, generates that inner sense of illumination or well-being, and we allow this to generate further, expanding outwards from the central point, with no need to push very hard, just allowing it to flow. Never leaving behind that sense of comfort that we have already built up from our meditation so far. Keeping the mind steady, calm, relaxed, almost as if we were nothing more than the observer in our meditation, with no real need to interfere in the process. Almost as if we're taking a step back and just observing what's going on. So gently placing our awareness at the center of the inner experience, allowing the peace energy, that sense of loving kindness, to radiate outwards in all directions, covering and infusing our entire body and our being. The sense of love and the affirmation that we be well and happy, free from suffering, before letting it continue to expand outwards beyond ourselves into the whole room around us and all the living beings in the room, outwards to the whole of the building, all the living beings in the building, to the whole neighborhood and all of the beings in the neighborhood. By the same token, to the whole city, country, the whole continent, and the rest of the world, sharing this light, love, and peace energy to whoever or whatever is within our reach, with the affirmation that may our loving kindness reach out to all people, all sentient beings without exception. May they live free from danger, from sadness, from from suffering of all kinds. May they live in happiness and peace. May all those with misfortune become free from sadness and sorrow. May joy, bliss and happiness spread in the heart of every person. And we extend our loving kindness, our compassionate intention, further outwards, almost like the full moon spreading its light across the sky, but in our case extending that peace energy to every living being, regardless of race, religion or creed, simply sharing universal love and wishing them all to be free from harm, to be established in joy and happiness. And through the tiny good intentions of meditators everywhere extending loving kindness together, then a tide of goodness and peace will extend across the whole of the face of this planet, beyond borders, beyond boundaries, reaching every sentient being. And we can also extend loving kindness to particular friends, family or loved ones, whether they're living or have passed on, embracing them within our peace energy, with this loving kindness, whether they are here or elsewhere, with the affirmation that they find comfort, loving kindness, hope. And may the seeds of compassion be planted in their hearts, minds and souls. So in this way we extend the light and energy without limits for a few more moments now in silence until we come to the appropriate time. Sappha Putthanuppavena, Sappha Dhammanuppavena, Sappha Sankhanuppavena, Sattha Soti, Bhavantu. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gently finishing your practice. So to return gently to our subject matter for today, let's continue by looking at the noble truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. The Pali word used for this truth is Magha, which simply means the path, or Dukkha Nirodha Gamini Patipatha, which means practice leading to cessation of suffering. It refers equally to the middle way and to the Noble Eightfold Path. The term middle way or Majjhima Patipatha doesn't mean moderation in all things, but rather to extinguish craving by steering in one's spiritual practice between the extremes of sensual indulgence or Kama Sukhalikkhanu Yoga and self-mortification or Attakila Yoga. Such cultivation is a way of training ourselves until the mind can wriggle itself free of craving, something achieved by freeing the mind of all the thoughts that cause it to move. For as long as the mind is not still, it has no way of extinguishing craving. On the contrary, when the mind becomes still, it will gain the clarity and brightness to identify the defilements remaining within it, and the power to uproot them.
The path leading to the cessation of suffering can also refer to the path consisting of 8 factors, namely right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, which is why it's called the Eightfold Path. As shown on the slide, the Eightfold Path is cyclical in nature, effectively a spiral that zeroes in on the still or enlightened mind. The Noble Eightfold Path can be found at all levels of advancement, although the way it's applied changes with the level of practice. At the initial level, in other words, at the outside coils of the spiral, right view would mean confidence in the logic of karma and the refuge of the Triple Gem, as well as overcoming 10 sorts of false view. Right intention in the initial cycle would mean intending to break free from the influence of sense desire, vengefulness, and aggression by being generous, keeping 5 precepts, and meditating. Right speech in the initial cycle would mean avoiding lies, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle chatter. Right action in the initial cycle would mean refraining from killing or cruelty towards living beings, stealing, and sexual relations outside marriage, as well as generally doing things by the rules. Right livelihood in the initial cycle would mean refraining from earning one's living by selling weapons, slaves, animals to the slaughterhouse, alcohol, drugs, poison, or other forms of exploitation, fixing weights and measures used in business, or otherwise misleading customers. Right effort in this initial cycle would mean not succumbing to unwholesome habits which you never did before, overcoming any unwholesome habits you already possess, developing good habits that you never had before, and maintaining the good habits you already have. Right mindfulness in the initial cycle would mean keeping our mind on wholesome thoughts without distraction, especially by practicing meditation until attaining one-pointedness of mind. Right concentration in the initial cycle would mean entering upon the mental absorptions. At the higher levels, right view would mean fiercely accurate understanding of life and the world, untainted by defilements, based on thorough understanding of the Four Noble Truths, namely insight into the clinging of the 5 aggregates. Right intention in the higher cycles would mean release from the 3 types of wrong preoccupation or akusala vitaka and bias or agati. Right speech in its higher cycles would mean unless one's words can produce skillful speech, one would prefer to maintain noble silence. Right action in the higher levels would mean practice for the removal of every last trace of ignorance and craving. Right livelihood in the higher cycles would mean earning one's living in a compassionate way. Right effort in the higher cycles would mean dedicating ourselves actively to the attainment of nirvana. Right mindfulness in the higher cycles would mean cultivating the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Right concentration in the higher cycles would mean seeing and knowing the 4 noble truths and the 3 universal characteristics in the 5 aggregates until casting off the defilements, attaining cessation of suffering, and entering upon nirvana. If the meditator cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path purely, completely, and according to the principles of the middle way, which according to the Dhammakaya interpretation means the mind entering continuously upon the pathway at the center of the body, the mind will enter the absorptions and will experience fusion of the path factors into unity, a state otherwise known as Makatsamanki. This is the trailhead of the pathway to nirvana. So the thing to remember is that you need to train yourself sequentially and then simultaneously in all 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. By this point, it's true that we know all 4 noble truths, but the knowledge thus far is only theoretical. In fact, for the Arya Satya to work, we need to see them, not once, but according to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, 12 times, 3 cycles in 12 characteristics. Seeing the noble truths is different from seeing other things because the seer is transformed for the better by the act of seeing them. The sight of craving will immediately cause us to relinquish that craving, and having relinquished it, you will recognize the completion of the task. It's equivalent to recognizing this is the medicine, while automatically realizing this medicine should be taken, and eventually recognizing this medicine has successfully been taken. It is a special sort of seeing that can be achieved only by the eyes of inner bodies of enlightenment. For sticklers who object to mention of inner bodies because of the lack of references to these in the scriptures, the eyes of the inner bodies can be referenced in the Julanidesa. So if listeners prefer, they can think of the Buddha eye rather than the body of enlightenment, being responsible for seeing the Four Noble Truths in this special way. The extra power of the Buddha eye, not only to see but to know, is different to the eyesight of bodies still trapped in the mundane level, none of which are sufficiently refined to recognize the Four Noble Truths in this special way that I've described. On this point, the great abbot of Wat Phak Nam, Phra Mongkol Thepani, explains the comparative wisdom available to inner bodies, or inner eyes if you prefer, at each level, and summarized: if you are able to attain the body of enlightenment, or the Dhammakaya, you will find that it is many tens of times wiser than our human physical body, and you can read the detail yourself of what he said in the slide. So the true meaning of the word insight or vipassana meditation is insightful vision, or seeing things according to their true nature, or seeing them thoroughly from every perspective. Only the Buddha eye has the ability to penetrate the truth, especially to know the origins of defilements, how they come to enslave the mind, and how we can overcome them. This is the major difference from the eyes of bodies belonging to the mundane levels of mind, to which the defilements are still invisible. So, the task at this level is for the meditator to use the Buddha eye to see the Four Noble Truths in each of their inner bodies. For each body, there are 3 stages or cycles of examination, where Satchayana means seeing the existence of the Noble Truth in that body, where Ichayana means seeing what needs to be done in relation to that Noble Truth in the body, and Katayana means recognize the completion of the task in relation to the Noble Truth in that body. As there are 4 Noble Truths multiplied together according to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, we get 12 characteristics. But remember, in that teaching, Kondanya only reached the level of stream enterer. In order to use the Noble Truths to eradicate all the defilements from the mind, to reach the same level as the Buddha or the Arahants, although it is the same sequential method, the work needs to be continued, making use of all the Dhamma bodies, eradicating the final 10 subtle defilements or fetters, or samyojana as they're called in Pali, from the mind. For this reason, the great abbot of Wat Phak Nam referred not to 12 tasks, but 16, which multiplies the 4 Noble Truths by the 4 inner bodies in which they must be seen. According to the great abbot, a person must complete 16 tasks until invulnerable to hardship that you can call nirvana if you like. So the process goes something like this. You use the eyes of the Dhammakaya Gotrapu body to examine the Noble Truths in the physical human body until you attain the Dhammakaya stream enterer body, which means you have managed to overcome the fetters of self-view or Sakkaya Titi, doubt or Vicikiccha, and attachment to rites and rituals or Silabbata Paramasa. Then you use the eyes of the Dhammakaya stream enterer body to examine the Noble Truth in the angelic body until you attain the Dhammakaya once returner body, which means that you have managed to further diminish the fetters of desire or raga, hatred or dosa, and delusion or moha. Then you use the eyes of the Dhammakaya once returner body to examine the Noble Truths in the former Brahma body until you attain the Dhammakaya non-returner body, which means you have managed to uproot sensual grasping or gamaraka and annoyance or patika. Then you use the eyes of the Dhammakaya non-returner body to examine the Noble Truths in the formless Brahma body until you attain the Dhammakaya Arahant body, which means that you have managed to uproot attachment to the form realms or ruparaka, attachment to the formless realms or aruparaka, stubbornness or mana, absent-mindedness or udpacha, and ignorance or avijja. The cyclical pathway of attainment is rather like the way a nut gradually makes progress along the screw thread, eradicating the defilements as it rotates. It was because the Buddha and all the Arahants had completed the 16 tasks in their entirety that they could attain full enlightenment with no further rebirth. In conclusion, you need to practice sequentially if you are going to be successful in seeing the Four Noble Truths. Importantly, it should be noted that the Noble Truths cannot be seen by those who have not yet attained the body of enlightenment. Those who have attained the Dhammakaya from the level of Dhammakaya Kotrapu upwards are able to do the final work of eradicating the 10 fetters from the mind by seeing the Noble Truths and can eventually become fully enlightened. So to finish today, we have time for a quick scriptural story about someone who managed to reform their destiny by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. In the time of the Buddha, there was a hunter who lived near Dharmendabala Vihara called Milaka. Every day since his youth, he had been involved with killing animals one way or another, until there was virtually nothing left in his heart in the way of virtue. One day he'd been setting traps in the forest and was thirsty. He saw some monks practicing meditation in the forest, and looking for something to drink, walked straight into their encampment without any pretense of respect. The monks were sitting or walking in meditation, trying to maintain the quality of their minds. Even though some of the monks were already arahants, he didn't feel any admiration when he saw them because his mind was still caught up with the usual concerns of hunting and trapping. He ignored the monks and walked straight into one of the monks' huts, looking for something to drink. Inside, he took the lid off a water jar, but even though the jar was full of water, it looked completely empty to him. Frustrated, he turned around and accused the monks. "What do you do all day long, sitting around instead of topping up your water jars while your neighbors go thirsty?" An arahant nearby knew that Milika was unable to see the water he needed because of his own bad karma. He said, "Take a rest in the shade and I will bring you some water." He kept bringing Milika cups of water until his thirst had been quenched and he could start to talk some sense. Now that his thirst was slaked, Milika started to notice the things around him. He saw how radiant the arahant was and appreciated what good manners he had. He realized, my bad karma must be extreme if I can't see the water that's filling that water jar. Supposing I were to die today, I would definitely go to the bad place. My life is in a sorry state. Milika started to discuss the Dharma with the arahant and appreciated his own burden of past bad deeds. Today, he listened to the advice of the arahant for the first time in his life, and he started to fear the consequences of all the bad stuff he'd done. In a desperate bid to change his destiny, he requested to ordain as a monk. The arahant sized up Milika's potential and allowed him only to take lower ordination as a novice, teaching him how to meditate. Unfortunately, because of all the hunting and trapping in his past, his meditation was always disturbed by mental images. Every time he closed his eyes for meditation, he always felt as if all the animals he had killed had come back to haunt him, twitching as if in their death throes in his lap. He couldn't close his eyes without getting the waking nightmares. In the end, he pleaded with the arahant to let him disrobe again, because his original inspiration had burned out. He thought it would be better to revert to his own livelihood of hunting. He thought that if he was going to fall into hell anyway, that it wouldn't make much difference if it were a little bit deeper than before. The arahant didn't argue with the novice, but he asked Milika to do one final chore before disrobing, to bring some green wood to make a fire. Milika thought it was strange to choose green wood instead of tinder, but he did as he was told. But try as hard as he might to light the fire, he couldn't raise any smoke. The arahant asked Milika to stand back and said that he would light the fire for him. The arahant meditated and split the earth deep down until both of them could see into the deepest level of hell. The arahant took a piece of embers from that hell the size of a firefly and lit the green wood. It burned to a cinder in a fraction of a second, as if it was nothing more than tissue paper. This really frightened the novice. Before, he hadn't realized how hot the fires of hell were. He thought to himself, if that's what an ember did to green wood, what would it do to me if I became a denizen of that hell? Milika changed his mind about disrobing. No matter how hard it was for him to meditate, he kept going in earnest. The hauntings became less frequent and eventually disappeared altogether. His mind became more peaceful and radiance arose from within. Eventually, the Arahant allowed him to take full ordination as a monk, with the full title of Milakatisatera. The new monk practiced further until one day, when he managed to maintain the positivity of mind to the full, his continuous practice came to fruition. His teacher guided him with the advice, "Success will accrue to all who are earnest, who have mindfulness, right livelihood, and act only with intention, self-controlled and abiding in the Dharma without recklessness." Milaka scrutinized his practice and realized that he had the earnest his teacher was talking about ever since seeing the fires of hell. He had mindfulness because he was no longer disturbed by haunting images. He had right livelihood because as a monk he had upheld the monastic discipline perfectly. Lastly, he had started carefully considering his words and had stopped acting recklessly. Milaka saw that he had accomplished all the tasks his teacher had set for him. He started to believe in himself and his own good conduct, and this allowed his mind to become unified and attain the body of enlightenment. He used the Buddha eye to examine the Four Noble Truths until he became enlightened at the level of the non-returner or anagami. He couldn't manage to attain arahantship because he had not trained himself sufficiently in previous lifetimes. When he passed away, since he could not yet enter upon nirvana, he was reborn in the Brahma world called the Suttavasa, where he continued to purify his mind until he could enter upon nirvana. So this session I've introduced to you blessing 33 on seeing the Four Noble Truths. For my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, we'll continue with the fourth blessing in the 9th subgroup, number 34, on the attainment of nirvana. For good measure, I'd like to remind viewers that you can email your questions about meditation or what you've heard in the lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out in the slide, and I will do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to avoid recklessness or complacency as we continue to deal with the knock-on health and economic effects of the pandemic. Attain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will feel better informed about practicing the Noble Eightfold Path to reach an end of suffering. So for today, this is me, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, signing off for now. So long, folks, and stay safe.